Have you ever heard of a team that was so bad, companies were literally afraid to be associated with them? Well, today we are diving into the absolutely wild story of how the British cycling team went from being a total laughingstock for a century to complete global dominance. And it all came down to one powerful, but really simple idea. Okay, so first, to really get the scale of this turnaround, you have to understand just how terrible things were. And I'm not just talking about a slump. No, we're talking about nearly 100 straight years of British cyclists being, well, kind of pathetic on the world stage. Just look at this number, 1. In 95 years of Olympic competition, that's almost a whole century, British riders won a single gold medal. 1. They were consistently showing up to the biggest event in the world and just not delivering. And you know what was even worse than the Tour de France, which is the absolute pinnacle of the sport? For 110 years, not a single cyclist from Great Britain had ever won it. They weren't just losing, they weren't even in the conversation.
This quote right here just perfectly sums up their rock-bottom reputation. Can you imagine being so consistently bad that a company refuses to take your money? They were worried that if people saw the British team using their bikes, it would actually damage their brand. That's how bad it was.
But then in 2003, everything started to change. They hired a new performance director, a guy named Dave Brailsford. And he came in with this obsession, really, with a strategy he called the aggregation of marginal gains. It was a totally radical idea that would completely flip their story on its head.
And here it is, straight from the man himself. The idea wasn't some magic bullet. It wasn't about finding one massive breakthrough. It was about breaking down the entire act of riding a bike into its tiniest parts, and then just making each one 1% better. The theory was that all those tiny gains would add up to something huge.
So what is it really? It's this relentless hunt for tiny little upgrades everywhere you look. Not just the obvious stuff, but in every single detail, all based on this faith that, when you put them all together, they create a massive advantage.
So how'd they actually do it? Well, Brailsford and his team went on this almost obsessive search for those little 1% improvements. They started with the usual things you'd expect, but then they went into areas nobody had ever thought to look.
First, yeah, you had the obvious stuff. They got more comfortable bike seats, they started rubbing alcohol on the tires to get a better grip. They even tested all their fabrics in a wind tunnel to see which was the most aerodynamic. You know, pretty standard, high-performance tweaks you might expect.
But this is where it gets crazy, and where you really see the philosophy in action. They didn't stop there. They tested different massage gels to see which one helped muscles recover fastest. They hired a surgeon, to teach the riders the absolute best way to wash their hands to avoid getting sick. They found the perfect pillow and mattress for each individual rider to get the best possible sleep. And my favorite one? They painted the inside of the team truck white, just so they could spot tiny bits of dust that might mess with the performance of their finely tuned bikes. Now that is commitment.
And as all these hundreds of tiny improvements started to stack up, the results, well, they came way faster than anyone could have believed. This wasn't some slow and steady improvement, it was an absolute explosion. They went from zeros to heroes overnight and just started to completely dominate the sport.
The success just kept coming. Just 5 years after they started, they won 60% of the available gold medals at the Beijing Olympics. 4 years after that, in London, they broke 9 Olympic records and 7 world records. And in that same year, Bradley Wiggins finally broke that 110-year curse and won the Tour de France. And then his teammate Chris Froome won it 4 more times in the next 5 years.
Let's just stop and think about this for a second. Winning 60% of all the gold medals available in your sport at the Olympics, that is an insane level of dominance. This chart really shows how a team that was a total afterthought just suddenly owned the podium.
And it wasn't just a fluke at the Olympics. Oh no. Over the next 10 years, to prove the point, British cyclists won an unbelievable 178 world championships.
And of course, they conquered their biggest demon, the Tour de France. Remember, after 110 years of absolutely nothing, they won it 5 times in just 6 years. It's considered probably the most successful run in the entire history of cycling.
Now this is an amazing sports story, for sure. But the real magic of this idea is that it doesn't just apply to cycling. It applies to all of us. This is a fundamental principle for success and improvement in pretty much anything.
So how does this actually work, right? How does a team of athletes who were just, okay, suddenly become world beaters with changes that on their own seem so tiny and almost insignificant?
The answer is compounding. It's the same magic that makes your money grow in a savings account. These small improvements don't just add up one by one. They build on each other, they multiply, and they grow exponentially over time until you get these incredible, mind-blowing results.
Okay, so the big question is, how can you do this? How can you take this same idea and use it for your job, your health, a new skill, really any goal you're trying to achieve?
Well, it's actually a pretty simple three-step process. First, you take your big goal and you just break it down into all its little tiny pieces. Second, for each one of those pieces, you just ask yourself, how can I make this just 1% better? That's it. This turns a giant scary goal into a bunch of small, easy tasks. And third, and this is the most important part, you have to be consistent. You apply those little changes every single day, and then you just let the power of compounding take over. So, I'll leave you with this one question to think about. What's your white truck? What's that small, overlooked detail in your own life that if you just improved it by 1% could be the start of something truly amazing?